Good day, all. This talk will examine the feminist approach to crime. Feminist criminologists have argued that traditional male criminology has always been sexist, prejudiced, and unfair to women. Indeed, they argue that early male criminology simply consisted of misogyny or woman-hating dressed up as pseudoscience. They argue that men have been creating an image of dangerous women as far back as the Bible, which blamed Eve for all of humanity's problems. The Catholic Church resurrected this idea from the 15th to the 18th centuries with the witch hunts, creating the image of the dangerous witch to provide moral justification for the torture and murder of thousands of innocent women, just to bolster its sagging authority. But with the church saying that women were innately evil and that it was men's Christian duty to beat the evil out of them, early modern European laws in the 18th and 19th centuries treated women very harshly. Husbands had the legal right to chastise, which meant a man could legally beat his wife. Meanwhile, it was a crime for a woman to nag her husband or any other man in public, and a woman who did so could be whipped, pilloried, or forced to wear what was called a brank or scold's bridle, which was a helmet that had a mouthpiece with metal spikes which would cut into the woman's tongue if she attempted to speak. When criminology got underway in the late 19th century, it accepted the prevailing view that women were innately evil, amoral liars who would commit monstrous crimes unless kept under strict male control. Cesare Lombroso, the so-called father of criminology, argued that women were biologically inferior and primitive, but that their very weakness had led them to develop a deceitful cunning which made them particularly dangerous. This approach, supposedly based in scientific biology, but in reality based in religious morality, continued to predominate in criminology through the first half of the 20th century, and still exists in diluted form with the argument that PMS drives women to commit irrational and violent acts. It was only when feminists turned to the study of criminology in the late 60s and early 70s that this model was challenged. In particular, feminists rejected the view that women's biology gives them built-in criminal tendencies, and instead began to examine the social factors that can push women into crime. First of all, feminists focused on the issue of gender roles. They argued that it was a patriarchal society and not biology which had assigned women a passive, submissive social role to play. So, they argued that whenever women tried to stand up and fight for their rights and fight for a more active social role, they would be promptly labeled as unnatural, deviant, dangerous, and criminal. Similarly, whenever women engaged in violence, even though the severity of the violence was always much lower than that of male violence, it was seen as a shocking betrayal of their gender role, and so it was considered to be much more serious and was punished much more harshly than male violence. Women's roles have always been much more polarized than men's, between good girls and bad girls, saint or sinner, Madonna or whore. Role theory also argued that women were much less likely than men to engage in crime and violence because they'd been socialized to be relatively passive, non-violent, and domestically oriented. Even when women do engage in crime, they still tend to play a domestic role, For example, women are much more likely than men to engage in shoplifting, which is basically just doing a traditional woman's job, that is, shopping for groceries, except some women are so poor they can't afford to pay for their groceries. In the mid-70s, some theorists, such as Frida Adler, developed a new version of role theory known as liberation theory. This theory argued that as the women's movement, which was then called the women's liberation movement, expanded women's social roles to be more like men's, it would also expand women's role in crime. On the one hand, women were now being socialized to be more assertive, more aggressive, and on the other hand, women's greater involvement in the economy would give them more opportunities to commit crime. This theory sounds reasonable, and it is still put forward by some, but the facts just don't support it. First of all, women's violent crime has not gone up since the advent of the women's movement. Indeed, women have committed a steady 10 to 15% of violent crime in Canada ever since records began in the 19th century. Secondly, although women's rates of theft did rise in the late 70s and 80s, those crimes were not committed by liberated professional women or by professional women criminals engaging in high-stakes fraud or embezzlement. Rather, they consisted of petty theft, shoplifting, or welfare fraud, engaged in by women who were very much stuck in traditional women's roles at the bottom of the social ladder. The real reason why some women turned to theft at this time was not because they'd been liberated, but rather the exact opposite. The late 70s and 80s saw social programs which women needed being cut, and more working class women being forced into part-time minimum wage jobs. This process, which has been termed the feminization of poverty, and not feminism, is what forced increasing numbers of poor women, especially single mothers, to steal just to survive. Throughout the 21st century in Canada, about 80% of female inmates have been poor women, often even homeless women, engaging in non-violent, income-generating crimes. In other words, stealing to survive. Blaming feminism or the women's movement for women's crimes is just a new variation on the same old sexist argument that women standing up for their rights is unnatural, deviant, and criminal. More recent work by Marxist feminists and radical feminists, among others, has focused on women's oppression by men, including both the poverty caused by gender discrimination and the threat of male violence as the real causes of most crimes committed by women. While Western society, including the mass media, has generally exaggerated the impact of crimes committed by women, it has underplayed or even ignored crimes and violence committed against women. This includes weak laws against rape and assault by strangers, but a much more widespread problem has been domestic violence. So, we're now going to look at domestic violence as a case study of crimes against women. In the 19th century, as I said, men had the legal right to beat their wives. known as the right to chastise, and also had the legal right to rape their wives, known as the right to consortium. In Canada, these rights were abolished in the 1890s. However, the law continued to favour men, and it was almost impossible to obtain a conviction for domestic violence. As a result, it became police policy not to intervene in domestic disputes. This approach was based on that of the British police, whose attitude was eloquently summed up in 1954 by Commander G.H. Hetherill, then head of Scotland Yard, the famous London police force, which served as the model not just for the Canadian police, but for all Western police forces. And he said, and I quote, "There are only about 20 murders a year in London, and not all are serious. Some are just husbands killing their wives." In Canada, following lengthy pressure from the women's movement, domestic assault legislation was toughened up in 1983. And now that police had a realistic chance of gaining convictions in domestic dispute cases, their policy changed and they began to intervene. Since then, domestic dispute calls have become the single largest category of requests to police for help. So just how widespread is wife battering or domestic violence? Well, there is some disagreement on this. Most studies have concluded that around 10% of women living with a man are subject to physical abuse. In the year 2000, Statistics Canada ran a family violence survey which concluded that 8% of women living with a man in Canada are being physically abused, and also that 7% of men living with a woman are being physically abused. The reason for the similarity in these numbers is that for the most part, we're talking about the same couples. The man hits the woman, and the woman hits back. A cycle of violence develops, which turns violence into a family norm. Anyone living in the household, father, mother, grandparents, children, everyone learns that violence is a part of everyday life. So, out of the need for self-defense, everyone in the family becomes to some extent a violent person. As the old saying goes, violence begets more violence. However, since men are on average bigger and stronger than women, male violence remains much more severe than female violence. The 2000 StatsCan study found that 15% of female victims needed medical attention, compared to just 3% of male victims. Women in a domestic dispute are more likely to slap, kick, bite, or throw objects. They're also more likely to try to even up the odds by being the first to grab a weapon, a blunt object, a kitchen knife, or a gun. In the US, where about half of all households have guns, studies have shown that in domestic disputes, women are much more likely than men to threaten with and to use a gun. Men, on the other hand, are much more likely to use their hands, to beat with their fists, or to choke. Similarly, in Canada, men commit sexual assault on their spouses 7 times as often as women, and men kill their spouses 3 times as often as women. Indeed, in Canada, over 100 killings a year are what Commander Hetherill would call not serious, because they're just husbands killing their wives. These killings are very rarely premeditated. They're committed in spontaneous outbursts of rage as the final act in an escalating cycle of violence. All too predictable to the outsider, those involved usually never see it coming. Believe it or not, the husband is usually devastated when he realizes what he's done, that he's killed his wife, and in fact about 1 in 3 immediately commits suicide. When women kill their husbands, it can also be during a fight, but it is more likely to be a premeditated, preemptive strike, which the woman sees as the only way to stop the abuse. The most famous Canadian case of this type is the one portrayed in the book and TV movie Life with Billy, which told how in 1982 in Nova Scotia, Jane Stafford blew her husband Billy's head off with a shotgun, thereby ending 6 years of incredibly violent and degrading abuse. By her own account, she would probably have gone on taking the abuse until he killed her, except that he threatened to kill her son by her previous marriage. Some years later, she committed suicide. If you ever want to see a real horror movie, forget about your Frankensteins and your Draculas. Check out Life with Billy. The effectiveness of police intervention in stopping wife battering is still problematic. Although the number of charges being laid against abusive husbands has risen sharply since the law changed in 1983, the majority of convictions result only in probation, while jail sentences are often as low as just 1 day and very rarely longer than 30 days. In other words, they're just long enough to get the man good and mad at his wife for putting him there. Many women do not report abuse because they fear their husband's retaliation when he gets out of jail. So, is our justice system providing wives, and indeed women in general, with adequate protection from male violence? Well, certainly things have been improving since the 80s, but I would argue that the rise of the #MeToo movement shows that we still have a long way to go. Male violence towards women is not just a major component of crimes committed against women, it is also a major cause of crimes committed by women. Feminist criminologists, such as Canadian Bernard Chassel, have argued that when it comes to crime, most women are, and I quote, victims first, offenders second. 2 Canadian prison surveys in the 90s concluded that of women prisoners, about 75% had been physically abused and about 50% had been sexually abused. For Indigenous women, those numbers rose to about 90% and 60%. So, although not all women criminals have been abused, the majority have. And for most of these women, the abuse began in early childhood and continued in one form or another by one man or another through their entire lives. They lived in a world where violence was an everyday reality, a world where if you don't fight back, you'll be beaten to a pulp. A world where learning to be violent yourself is just a basic survival strategy. Most young women who get in trouble with the law are just trying to survive in a social environment that consists mostly of poverty and violence. The great irony is that instead of recognizing them as the most victimized and abused segment of our society, and doing something to help them, our justice system criminalizes them and punishes them as if they haven't taken enough punishment already. Although our media likes to dramatize violent crimes by women, they are in fact only a small minority of women's crimes. Violence by women remains much less frequent than violence by men. Women are much more likely to commit crimes like shoplifting, welfare fraud, drugs, or prostitution. Prostitution is perhaps the most female of all crimes. Although there are male prostitutes, mostly catering to gay men, over 80% of prostitutes in Canada are women. So, we're now going to look at prostitution as a case study of crimes committed by women. Theories of prostitution have changed considerably over time. Early theories of prostitution, like early theories about women in general, were mostly grounded in religious morality. In 19th century Canada, prostitution was not illegal, although streetwalkers were sometimes prosecuted under the vagrancy laws for loitering. But the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of a strong reform movement led by religious groups in both Canada and the US. This movement pushed for both temperance or prohibition, in other words, for the criminalization of alcohol, in which it was temporarily successful in the 1920s, and for the criminalization of prostitution, in which it has been partially successful. These Christian groups argued that prostitution was immoral and that therefore it must be declared illegal and stamped out. Early 20th century structural functionalist theories essentially went along with this argument. Structural functionalism is sometimes called a consensus theory because it emphasizes the importance of social consensus. Structural functionalists argued that prostitution offends the moral consensus of society and that criminalization was necessary to defend public morality. Prostitutes were portrayed as deviant, morally impaired, disease-ridden women who hopefully could be rehabilitated through imprisonment and strict discipline. This position is still held by some religious groups, but very few criminologists would still argue this way. The problem with early structural functionalist theories is that they overestimated the degree of moral consensus in North America. Yes, religion provides one moral position, but another long-standing tradition, which takes the opposite moral position, is the civil rights tradition, or civil libertarianism. This tradition argues that every woman has the right to do whatever she wants with her own body. This is an argument that's been applied to birth control, abortion, pornography, and prostitution. Civil libertarians say that if your religion tells you not to go to prostitutes, then don't. Nobody's going to force you. But in the Western world, fewer and fewer people identify as religious. And religious people do not have the right to impose their morality on non-religious people. If one does not accept religious morality, then prostitution should be seen as just another occupation, a job. To be precise, it is a profession in the service sector, like most women's jobs, such as waitress, nurse, hairdresser, and so on. As the late great George Carlin put it, if sex is legal and selling is legal, then why is selling sex illegal? Civil libertarians argue that neither the church nor the state should have the right to prevent any woman from making a living from her body. According to this argument, legalization of prostitution would be an advance in both the civil rights and the economic opportunities of women. And indeed, there are a number of organizations in Canada and throughout the Western world fighting for the legalization of prostitution. For example, in Canada, there is an organization named Prostitutes and Other Women for Equal Rights, or POWER. And in the US, Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics, or Coyote. Both moral positions still have their supporters. But when criminologists began to seriously study prostitution for the first time in the 70s, 80s, and 90s through interviews and observation, it quickly became apparent that, at least when it comes to street prostitutes, neither of these moral positions had anything to do with their reality. Streetwalkers do not become involved in the sex trade either because they're immoral deviants or through a personal career choice. They become involved because of male violence and sexual abuse. As Canadian criminologist Carrie Fedech put it, ultimately, prostitution is about exploitation and abuse. In the 90s, studies of prostitution were conducted in several Canadian provinces, including Saskatchewan. It was found that most street prostitutes ranged in age from just 11 to 20, and that the average age at which they began prostitution was just 14 years old. This fact alone tells us we're not dealing with hardened criminals or sexual deviants or career women. We are dealing with abused children. The majority of them are teenage runaways from homes where they have experienced physical and/or sexual abuse. Even when they're on the street, most of these girls do not consciously decide to go into prostitution. Most commonly, they meet a man who's looking for just such girls. They enter into a relationship, but one in which it is understood that she is exchanging sex for room and board. After a while, the man starts to pressure her to contribute to the rent by selling her body on the street, and often reinforces this pressure with violence. Seeing no alternative to abuse at home or abuse on the street, the girl complies. She ends up giving almost all the money she makes to the man, who becomes her pimp and who, she eventually learns, has a number of young women like her, all working for him in his so-called stable. Not all street prostitutes have pimps, but the majority of them do. Most of these girls come from the poorest and most marginalized sectors of society. In Saskatchewan, the overwhelming majority of them are Indigenous. They have been used as sex objects and occasional punching bags by men through their whole lives. First by family members, then by their pimps, then by their clients or Johns. They are viewed and treated as disposable objects that men can rape or beat virtually without repercussions from the law. And, having been treated that way their whole lives, many of them have self-esteem so low that they even believe that they deserve the abuse, and so they make no attempt to leave, at least until they get a little older and wiser. Very few street prostitutes continue past their early 20s. Partly, this is because, as they get older and wise up, they realize that there are other alternatives open to them. But partly it is also due to the nature of male demand. Most men who go to streetwalkers want teenage prostitutes. There are a number of reasons for this. Partly it is because we live in a culture that glorifies and commodifies teenage female sexuality. Partly it is because there is a widespread myth that younger prostitutes are less likely to have STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, because they haven't been doing it for so long. But primarily, it's because for these men, prostitution is as much about power as it is about pleasure. The attraction of teenage girls is that they can be easily intimidated into doing whatever the man wants. For example, most Johns don't want to use condoms. Older prostitutes generally insist, saying, "No glove, no love." Young girls, however, can often be pressured into having unprotected sex. This is why they do not, in fact, have lower rates of STDs than older prostitutes, and it's also why about half of them have had at least one child by the age of 19. However, this is not the whole story of prostitution, because in fact there are two very different kinds of prostitutes: streetwalkers and escorts or call girls. Everything that I've said so far is about streetwalkers. Escorts live in a very different world, and the difference is all about money and class. Streetwalkers are prostitutes for working class men. Escorts are for middle class and upper class men. Streetwalkers usually charge from $50 to $100 a time. Escorts charge thousands of dollars per night. As a result, streetwalkers earn a low working class income, but escorts earn a high middle class income. More than that, streetwalkers live in fear every time they step into a John's car, never knowing whether they're going to be beaten, raped, or even killed. Escorts, by contrast, have a head office, which knows who they're with, and clients who generally have enough social standing that they don't even want it publicly known that they were with an escort, much less be accused of beating one up. An encounter with a streetwalker is quick, impersonal, and dehumanizing. An encounter with an escort is more like a fantasy date. An evening together, dinner, followed by sex. If the man is offensive or appears creepy or dangerous, the escort usually has the opportunity to leave without having sex and before he can get violent. In addition, streetwalkers come from the poorest sectors of society and have virtually no education. But middle-class men want middle-class prostitutes who can display some knowledge of culture, a touch of class on their fantasy date. So, escorts mostly come from middle-class backgrounds and are somewhat older, being in their late 20s and 30s, and have a much better education. These women are the professional women who have made a deliberate career choice to enter prostitution and who have organized to fight for the legalization of their profession in organizations like Power and Coyote. Streetwalkers and escorts also live in different worlds when it comes to their treatment by the justice system. Streetwalkers are continually harassed by police. Escorts almost never are. The only exception is if their operation becomes so well known that it becomes an embarrassment to the authorities, as for example happened with Heidi Fleiss, the so-called Madam to the Stars, who operated an escort service in Hollywood in the 90s that got shut down because it became literally world famous. But for streetwalkers, our justice system not only does nothing to protect these young girls from abuse, it piles punishment on top of it. In 1983, Canada's criminal code was amended to state that clients, or Johns, are just as criminally liable as prostitutes. However, in practice, studies show that when police intervene in prostitution, which is almost always with streetwalkers, the girls are charged over 90% of the time, while their clients are charged less than 10% of the time. Moreover, so-called bad dates or assaults against prostitutes are rarely acted on by police, even when they know the man responsible. Similarly, pimps are rarely charged and receive only short jail sentences, even if convicted. Since the 70s, feminists have argued that the law must be changed to recognize that streetwalkers are victims, not criminals. The priorities of the justice system should be turned upside down, and lengthy jail sentences should be handed out to pimps and johns because they are engaging in the exploitation and sexual abuse of minors. In 1988, Canada did finally pass a law making it illegal to purchase the sexual services of a minor. However, in practice, police have been reluctant to prosecute men caught with underage prostitutes, and the courts have been very lenient on them. For example, in Saskatchewan in 1999, a member of the Legislative Assembly, an elected provincial politician, was convicted of purchasing sex from a minor and received only 4 months probation, with no jail term, not even a fine. I've used the comparison between streetwalkers and escorts to try to show that in itself, prostitution is not necessarily either a good thing or a bad thing. It is a social institution, it is an economic transaction, and sometimes it's a criminal act. But as long as men want sex and have the money to pay for it, there will be prostitution. It's not called the oldest profession for nothing. However, the nature of prostitution can vary enormously. Escorts make a good income doing a job which they apparently want to do enough that they are organizing and fighting to have it legalized. Streetwalkers, on the other hand, live lives of poverty, violence, drugs, and disease. Moreover, streetwalkers bother the people who live on the streets that they walk, or stroll, as it's termed, and so they provoke neighborhood anger. Escorts, on the other hand, going out on their fantasy dates, bother no one. Accordingly, the main social problem with prostitution lies with working class prostitutes, or streetwalkers. In conclusion then, is there an alternative to streetwalkers for men who don't have thousands of dollars a night to spend on sex? Yes, there is. It is the alternative that's been tried in the Scandinavian countries of establishing so-called red light districts. This approach recognizes that the only way to get any kind of state control of prostitution is to first legalize it, then regulate it. Once you legalize it, prostitution becomes a zoning problem. Outside the designated zone or district, the police can impose a zero-tolerance policy on streetwalkers because now they have somewhere to go where they won't bother people in residential neighborhoods. Inside the red light district, in order to operate, each brothel must obtain a license. And in order to do so, they must ensure that the girls are not underage, that they get regular health checks for STDs, that they get paid a reasonable wage, and that there is security to protect the girls in case clients turn violent. In this way, although I would argue that prostitution is still to some extent a dehumanizing experience, still it is possible to take most of the violence, abuse, and exploitation out of it. But to do so, we have to recognize that criminalizing the male desire for sex and the women who provide that sex is not the answer. That concludes what I have to say on the feminist approach to crime. A transcript of this talk is available if you're interested. Good day.